Good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to have you all here at this day of philosophy for the lecture by Professor Margrit Shildrick. Let me first do some housekeeping so that you have an idea of what the program for this session looks like. So this session will be structured as follows. After my introductory lines, which is what I'm doing now, Professor Shildrick will deliver her lecture that will take about 45 minutes. After that, there is ample time for questions from you, the audience. Ample time, that means something like 20 to 30 minutes. I would like to ask you to save your questions for after the lecture. And then after the lecture, if you want to ask a question, you can just do a sign, which is somewhat comprehensible for me, and then someone with a microphone will be here to hand you the microphone, and then you can ask your question. If you do not feel sufficiently comfortable to ask your question in English, you can ask it in Dutch, and then I will try my best to translate that into English. Okay, so as for our speaker for this session, I guess several of you will be familiar with the work of Professor Shildrick. I know that especially holds for my students because we read the work of Professor Shildrick together, and it has occasioned very fascinating conversations and stimulating thoughts. And so as a guest professor of gender and knowledge production at Stockholm University, Margrit Shildrick works mainly in the field of biophilosophy, and we know her as the author of several books, including Leaky Bodies and Boundaries, Embodying the Monster, Dangerous Discourses, and 2023 there was Visceral Prostheses. And a central thread throughout these works, as I read them, is the normativity, the porosity, the precariousness, I would say, of boundaries, limits, borders, categorizations, and with that also of identity and the self. Maybe you can talk about that after the lecture as well. And evidently, the monster and the monstrous are notions where these threads kind of come together or are felted together in a sense. And these are also lively topics today, the monster and the monstrous. One of my, let's say, favorite monster-related anecdotes of the past months was the somewhat bizarre moment when our own Belgian Prime Minister, who self-identifies as a conservative right-wing politician, thought he was quoting a line from the philosopher and former Italian Communist Party leader Antonio Gramsci. It's quite a funny moment where our Prime Minister thought that he was supposedly quoting Antonio Gramsci, who would have said that now is the time of monsters. And there is something funny or strange, maybe even uncanny about a self-identifying conservative right-wing politician who is supposedly citing a left-wing Marxist philosopher. But what I find even more juicy is the fact that Gramsci never said or wrote such a thing. Or at least I couldn't find anything in his writings that translates into such a snappy quote, now is the time of monsters. Gramsci did write something in Italian, so pardon my Italian, like in questo interregno si verificano I fenomeni morbosi più svariati. Into English, that means something like, during this interregnum, a variation of morbid phenomena occurs. And I think that's an interesting quote, but it's not quite the same as now is the time of monsters. So the original quote by Gramsci refers to morbid phenomena, not to monsters. So it's fascinating that morbid phenomena gets rendered into, or gets rendered as monsters. And Gramsci's quote is also interesting because it refers to an interregnum, like an in-between period. which seems to invoke this idea of liminality, which is also a notion, the notion of in-betweenness, and a certain relationality to what the future may bring, is also a notion that figures in today's lecture. And so I guess what I wanted to signal with this anecdote, or the supposed quote, is that when it comes to Gramsci quotes, I rather trust Gramsci himself than politicians. And when it comes to monster quotes, I rather trust Margrit Shildrick than politicians. And so I will no longer tread this fine line between introducing the talk and spoiling its punchline. And I will just hand over to our speaker, Margrit Shildrick. Thank you.
Brilliant. So thank you all for coming, and a big welcome to you all. And I'd like to thank the organisers, Anais and Helena, and our signer, Christy, Katrin, and of course, Sepe. It's really nice to be here. Now, my title, as you can see, is Monstrous Bodies, Reimagining Representation. And it's no exaggeration to claim that right now the representation of the monstrous, and that would include the anomalously embodied, the deformed, the devalued other, leaks and flows across material, political, philosophical, artistic, and bioscientific imaginaries alike. From every academic outlet, new research appears, new conferences are convened, new days of philosophy, and new works are published. So I'm going to ask, what's behind this intense investment? Monsters and the monstrous have historically always invoked the contradictory responses of often simultaneous fascination and fear. And that tells us something important about the boundaries between the human and the monstrous, that they're dangerously porous. How those boundaries are maintained and deconstructed serves to map out who we are and how so-called normal embodiment is defined. So the question is the monster an absolute other, or is it a mirror of our own being? And we feel a sense of ontological, epistemological, and ethical uncertainty and confusion that can resolve either in outright horror at the human inability to control a seemingly threatening materiality, or in a move towards an alternative and more hopeful mode of becoming. So my presentation today considers how the desire to represent monstrous corporeality as it transgresses normative expectations can be both scholarly and fun. And it's an apparent celebration that revalues what has been figured as the excluded other. But I'd caution that every recovery of the strange might also be a form of cover-up. And I'll explain that a bit more later. So could it be that representation, picturing the monster, itself grounds complicity with rather than a challenge to the normative order, and as such, it evokes a certain discomfort? So my presentation will consider the somewhat ambivalent ethics of representation before I turn to some other possible readings of how we might encounter anomalous embodiments. And the intention here is not to engage in some holier-than-thou exercise, nor indeed to judge the ludic possibilities that we might have, but to sketch out a critique that challenges us to better understand our own motivations and inevitable limitations. To avoid slipping into that familiar mode where our responses to monstrous otherness are to some extent pre-labelled, so they could be surprise or curiosity, unease, or voyeurism, I shall show a limited number of visual illustrations and encourage you to reflect on our viewing practices. The point is to place the viewers, that's you and me, into question, rather than the objects of scrutiny, to ask what's going on in those encounters. What exactly are we looking for when we look at the monster? So my approach engages with both historically situated and contemporary accounts of the monstrous that encompass not just humans, but all sorts of hybrid forms and morphological differences. I'm not implying that those of us here today will all fall on the same side of the binary of normal and abnormal, and many of us will readily identify with anomalous embodiment. But I guess that all of us feel the seductions of difference, whatever we judge that to be. And I hope to show that whatever appears to be beyond normative boundaries is instead symbolically and ontologically central. It makes us ask, who am I? Now, modernist Western knowledge is, of course, based on a thoroughgoing set of binaries, not least between self and other, human and non-human, normal and abnormal. And we tend to stay safely behind the putative boundaries that mark out categories. But what the monstrous signifies, above all, is ambiguity and ambivalence. Monsters do not recognize boundaries or classifications. They occupy liminal spaces, what Gloria Anzua calls the borderland. So what she says is, Los atravessados live here, the squint-eyed, the perverse, the queer, the troublesome, the mongrel, the mulatto, the half-dead. In short, those who cross over, pass through, or go through the confines of the normal. Now, monsters typically display, and this harks back to Aristotle, some form of lack or an excess corporeality, or displacement of elements, or the confusion of hybridity. And when we view some of these extraordinary forms, we need to realize that they are implicitly contrasted to a version of corporeal order and normativity. Yet we can readily recognize that our persistent fascination with the monstrous speaks to not just curiosity about the strange, but also longing for that from which we are estranged. It's a deeply ambivalent and discomforting feeling. Now, for most people, both historical and contemporary, monstrous embodiment in its many forms is more or less successfully managed through the privileged medium of sight. Of the other senses, hearing occasionally figures as a point of anxiety, things that roar unseen or go bump in the night. But for the most part, the monstrous other is silenced, and touch commonly evokes a destabilizing yuck factor and is carefully avoided. The point is that modes of visual representation function to create an interval between self and other. And that allows for a reassuring self-security. These are not working very quickly, unfortunately. So you can see that this is the interval of sight. Two circles, self on one side and other on the other, and this interval that keeps us safe in one or other category. Now, if we understand representation as the making present of what's absent in reality, then it's clear that what's at stake is not the encounter with any independent other, but a mediated, and thus ideological, version of what can be manipulated and controlled at will. What is spectacular in the everyday sense of the word, marvelous, fabulous, amazing, is reduced to a spectacle. And as Jonathan Crary puts it, the spectacle is a set of techniques for the management of bodies. The visual representation of the monstrous is packed with historical imagery that erases the singularity of any particular form with its excessiveness, ambiguity, and lack of containment. And it promotes instead a protective objectification, sociocultural prejudices, and sedimentary generalizations. Now, the early monster books, where should I point this? It's very slow. Okay, so the early monster books are packed with historical imagery that erases, the early monster books, these circulate in early modern Europe and for probably a couple of centuries beyond that. They're a case in point. So what you see here, one is a cover of a monster book, absolutely typical. And the second one is the monster of Krakow. The monster of Krakow is always reproduced in more or less the same form over, let's say, 200 years. But everybody will claim this was an eyewitness account that you're reading right now. I saw the monster of Krakow. So they're reduced to, the monsters in general are reduced to a relatively small number of recycled images. They just go on and on. Now, of course, there were economic considerations in play. Print was very expensive. But the effect becomes one of familiarity, of images fixed across decades, if not centuries. And they thus achieve a kind of order of their own that mitigates the threat of disorder. The cultural, religious, and political beliefs are far more in evidence than the singularity of any particular figure. And texts function not just to normalize the presumed embodiment of the authors and consumers of monster books as a matter of comparison, but to reinforce certain practices as desirable or permissible, while others are outlawed. Now, it's no surprise to find that most of the practices that are outlawed are the ones to do with sexual transgressions in either the monster or more likely its parents. So things like bestiality, copulating on the Sabbath, adultery, or even indecent posture. While on the macro level, the appearance of the monster could signal corruption in the state, political or sexual, in other words, of whole societies. So representation served as an important monetary and disciplinary function, but that's only half the story. So at the same time, they were also viewed as prodigies, and the slide here picks out some of the terms that go with that. Unfortunately, I can't read it from here. It's too light. So the terms it picks out would be amazing, marvelous, wonderful. Also, in modern terms, talented. So that's a new ambiguous way of using the word prodigy. But the original term, it was something extraordinary, seen as an omen, or as a portent. It told you what was going to come. Now, that differential response, and it is ambiguous in the meaning and significance of the monstrous, is in the end what saves them from being simply objects of knowledge. In its many forms, the anomalous body is continually constructed and reproduced as spectacle in historical documents, medical exhibits, art, freak shows. I mean, all sorts of things that are contemporary, like popular culture, TV reality shows, and of course, pornography. And of course, academic presentations. Before, however, turning to what I think is in excess of representation, I'm going to look more closely at what's at stake in representation itself. As the early monster books indicate, there's always a certain closure in the static image which transfixes and holds in place that which might otherwise remain dangerously at large. And it's, of course, this desire for the domestication of the strange that erases the monstrous as such. And in every case of visualization, all the elements of unruliness, excess, leakiness are carefully consigned to a single moment of display, ordered into a recognizable narrative that gives us what the philosopher Jacques Derrida calls the right of inspection. Now, I'm going to come back to Derrida shortly, but let's take that phrase at face value. The right of inspection demonstrates an exercise of power over otherness, to construct it within certain sanitized and manageable forms. The monstrous is, after all, as much a socio-political category as any ideal of bodily form, gender, or race. And classification, according to such categories, sets in train a further set of meanings that have served historically, and remember, not just historically, to underpin and justify sexist, imperialist, and colonialist enterprises. We could, for example, think of the multiple images of asylum seekers and migrants crowded into unsanitary holding camps in Europe and in the US that demonstrate the dehumanizing effects of monstrous categorization. And right now, characterizing human beings as monstrous is a very familiar tactic in the media that wants to cement the idea that there is a border crisis. And yes, in a philosophical sense, that is precisely what the monstrous evokes. They show the leakiness and the permeability of borders and boundaries that are supposed to hold things apart, not least self and other. Now, the archives of the monstrous are rich in both patriarchal and racist imagery, which all too often overlaps with the devaluation of disabled bodies. Increasingly, the sense of wonder that still haunts the edges of Ambrose Paré's Renaissance proto-scientific text of Monsters and Marvels has, by the time of Gould and Pike, lavishly illustrated a Victorian classification in his book Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine. And it reduces that category, monstrous, to just mere categorization, and there's all this whiff of prurience around it at the same time. Now, the significance of the links between disability and the monstrous have only recently been explored, but the ways in which monstrous discourse and representation have been used in the service of racism is very well illustrated. The notorious, much-analysed case of Sarah Bartman, of course that's not her real name, a Khoikhoi woman who was shown caged as the Hottentot Venus in 19th century Europe, served as a signifier of racial deviance, unbridled sexuality and monstrous corporeality. The fear and the fascination for the otherness of the African woman was managed through a close control over Bartman that extended even to her post-mortem examination and then subsequent display of her remains. Her exhibition during life exemplified all things primitive against which her European spectators could count themselves as civilized. In the 18th century, the widely accepted view was predicated on the teaching of French naturalist Jean-Louis Leclerc, who essentialized black people as, and I'm quoting, lecherous, riddled with animal sexuality and affected by physical characteristics that are closer to orangutans than to humans. Now, these words still shock us, and I'm not going to show any images of Bartman. Now, if Bartman's body was typically staged to reinforce, by contrast, the normativity of European embodiment, it raises the fundamental ethical question of representation. How can we refer back to and critique problematic contexts without reproducing the evident harm of them? Which is why I'm not showing the pictures here. Now, the colonialist and racist implications of display clearly intend to establish a moment of closure that sets out the generic conventions of the typical. In any spectacle, the body of the other is all surface. Without any sense of an inner meaning, its value is read off the visible anomaly. In short, putative deformity is seen as morally deficient. Although the spectacle may claim to bring the objects of scrutiny to life, it's a mapping exercise that fixes the characteristics of the strange in a permanent here and now. As Susan Stewart puts it, on display, the freak represents the naming of the frontier and the assurance that the wilderness, the outside, is now territory. And in such displays, the monstrous other is both silenced and blinded. Only the audience sees. Even when historical exhibitions of the human body promoted some form of interaction between the spectator and exhibit, it typically involved passive reactions on the part of the one shown. Viewing was strictly from a safe distance. I'm thinking about the kind of freak shows that happened in Coney Island, where somebody was shown on a stage, but the audience was held back. And that safe distance could typically reinforce the boundary between self and other, The speechless and unseeing other is afforded no agency. Any sense of a life lived is erased in favour of a fixed idealisation that speaks to the grasp of knowledge. Our contemporary representations of the monstrous in literature, film, art, and so on, a brief visit, if you like, to Google Images will open your eyes to a very disquieting door, is built on a historical range of bestiaries which are compiled by classical and medieval scholars, showing all sorts of weird and wonderful animals, often imaginary ones, the natural history of the Renaissance, the medical texts of the Enlightenment, and cabinets of curiosity collected by the wealthy. You might see it. There it is, there's a cabinet of curiosity. Rich people just collected random things together in display, and many of them were seen as monstrous. But the point of these cabinets of curiosity is that the owners had control over them. And whether it concerns images or words, the intertextuality or the interconnectedness of any representation is forgotten. And yet so often, Derrida raises the crucial question in The Right of Inspection. He says, who has the right to watch the scene, to capture the images, to interpret them, frame them, and edit them? Who has the right to invoke narratives and to be believed? In other words, such displays are about controlling boundaries between the putative self and the putative other. The implicit assertion is that we feel safe in the illusion that we know who we are by what we are not. Now, fascinating though the images can be, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, their deployment requires critique and negotiation to undo their racist, sexist, and ableist connotations. But although any open engagement with such representations may hope to counter the negativity associated with differential embodiment, that's not enough. We all might teeter on the brink of voyeurism that in its lack of self-recognition reduces the focus of our gaze to merely an object of repulsion and or fascination, whether their representations are historical or current, overtly fantastic or ostensibly accurate. But a more reflexive engagement will provoke just those questions that I want to ask of the ambivalent and never innocent nature of the encounter with the monstrous. So again, what exactly is it that we are looking for? With all due caution and self-reflection, I'd like to look at 4 related slides of conjoined twins spanning across time and place. And some of you may know that Foucault, in his book Abnormal, said that conjoined twinning was the prime signifier of the monstrous in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance period. So here we have, or we will, yes. First of all, a woodcut image from a monster book, 1557, which typically recounts and illustrates various ancient and medieval natural disasters, strange events, monstrous beings and apparitions. Then there's Chang and Eng Bunker, the so-called original Siamese twins, solidly en famille in the mid-19th century. Daisy and Violet Hilton, early 20th century music hall artists and film stars. And more recently, Dominican twins Maria and Teresa Tapia, who were photographed in 2015. Now, do any of us have the right to view these images, to interpret them, to invoke their stories? I just don't know. But in exercising our delicate sensibilities, do we equally give ourselves self-serving alibis against engaging with the necessary critique? Gillian Rose, for example, decries the postmodernist mistrust of representation as justifying a mystification of something, and I'm quoting, something we dare not understand because we fear it might be all too understandable, all too continuous with what we are, human, all too human. And nor is Derrida counselling withdrawal. As he says in an interview, tellingly called No One is Innocent, we must do and think the impossible. For him, critical questioning is a moment of crisis. In short, we should be undecided, at a loss, disturbed in our moral and cultural certainties, thrown into doubt. The creation of an ethics of encounter should involve a struggle. So what do we see? I'm going to offer a few observations on these highly staged images in the hope only of provoking further thought amongst us all. So the first one is archival. It's an image that's possibly monetary in its supposed warning against political and religious division, rather than seeking to represent an actual monstrous birth, even though these stock images were typically presented alongside eyewitnesses' accounts. Now, alternatively, the point could be to celebrate God's capacity to create marvels that disrupt the natural order. So the meaning of monstrous was depersonalized, highly fluid and contingent on the desires of the intended audience. Now, in this image of the Dominican twins, their status as monstrous is overcome. They're photographed as having lives of their own in the second picture on the left, where they've been separated, and the first picture where they are still conjoined. And having lives of their own is seen here as some kind of triumph. Now, we always know the currency of these before and after pictures. So the former is a state of failure and lack, and the latter is, we've won out against the odds. And in this case, it's the accomplishment of the clean and proper, and more important, singular and bounded form of embodiment. So once again, it's the viewer who has her desires met. The monstrous both shocks and is undone. Chang and Eng serve in a similar way. Separation was not an option for them, but they're represented as no longer the monstrous twins who thrilled freak show audiences, which was the fate of their early years, but as solid citizens, family men, in fact they were slave owners, reassuring in their very Victorian propriety. Now, surely the image represents here the monster tamed and domesticated, if only it weren't for the very visible, fleshy conjunction between them. So you can just see it under their shirts where they are conjoined. And finally here, the Hilton twins. Now, they were also celebrities, and it appears from contemporary accounts they were very talented musicians, but their publicity photo is quite different. It's playing on the illicit thrill of the monstrous by telling us in bold capitals that they were born joined together. So they're holding their instruments, but that's what the text is telling us. And the film poster on the right, for a film called Chained for Life, engages head-on with these same illusions. It says, will she pay the ultimate price for her sister's crime? And this references the lurid plot of the film in which one twin murders her husband. And then who's going to be prosecuted? Are they both going to be prosecuted or just one? Where does the guilt lie? Now, in none of these cases do we learn anything substantive about the objects of the gaze. Are they simply reflective surfaces, or does something of their intrinsic excess spill out? And I want to add one more image here that serves as a reminder that what the Western logos sees as monstrous may be undercut in other times, places, and ethnicities. This recent image is from an Indigenous Canadian artist, shows the self as already incorporating difference rather than being singular. Now, I'm not sure it might represent a two-spirit person who encompasses both male and female and masculine and feminine embodiment. But the point here is that other cultures may think very differently about the boundaries of the self. In his own reflections on the monstrous arrivant, Derrida gives further weight to the preceding considerations in the context that must inform any ethics of encounter. His deconstruction of the ways in which the normative response to the monstrous always entails a grasp of knowledge and a concomitant domestication of the strange is fully convincing, but it doesn't rest there. The grasp of knowledge does not imply any form of tactile engagement, but rather putting into place the safety of a specular interval. Yet while the right of inspection is a troubling constraint on monstrous alternatives to conventional standards, it's not an absolute limit. Now, I've explored elsewhere, the monster is not simply a signifier of otherness, but an altogether more complex figure that calls to mind not so much the other per se, but the trace of the other in the self. And in a challenge to the oppressive closure of identity, the bounded identity, which is on either side of the binary of self and other, Derrida suggests that we should learn, and I'm quoting, how to let the monster speak, or how to give it back speech, even if it is in oneself, in the other, in oneself. And that's far from applying any comfortable assimilation. You're not going to domesticate it, it's still there in you. Now, could the ability of monstrous difference to enter into the space of identity gesture towards an opening up of the signification? For all that strategies of representation seem to hold the other at bay and to cement and police the boundaries of difference, they fail in their aim. The separation and distinction proper to categorizations of the anomalous other are undermined by the persistence of a troubling familiarity. In T.P. Barman's highly popular 19th century show, What Is It? He was a showman, I think he showed all over America, really amazing new things, apparently. One of them was the spectacle of a putative man-monkey. In fact, this was a lot of makeup on a human being. And it created not just feelings of cultural and racial superiority in the viewing public, because of course it was a black man made up to look like a monkey, but inevitably raised the question of the supposed missing link in human evolution. And you have to remember this is the time of Darwin evolving. Now, in making such a connection, the distance, the interval created by the gaze is frustrated by its own object. In representation, the emphasis may be on difference, but fear and anxiety are most provoked by the opposite, the intimation that the monstrous others are all too human, close kin to even the most normatively embodied self. And to some extent, there's a tendency to think of the unrestrained sexism, racism, and disableism of the past as our monstrous other, of our more sophisticated understanding of otherness, but I'd suggest otherwise. In the early 21st century, the capacity of biotechnology to radically vary the body has not made morphological difference any more acceptable. Indeed, on the contrary, the processes of normalization correlative to the stable bounded subject are potentially even more powerful and thus call for greater resistance. And there's no difficulty in believing that the feature role of technoscience is to impose conformity. And as the ability to intervene in organic structures becomes increasingly commonplace, it may be that the very alterity and strangeness of the anomalous other will be endlessly recuperated within the known or eliminated entirely. Now, speaking of monstrous others, Derrida warns, quote, from the moment they enter into culture, the movement of acculturation, precisely of domestication, of normalization has already begun. The policing of boundaries and the right of inspection that affects both real and symbolic violence continues unabated. But that seeming impasse is not where Derrida leaves it, for the defining modality of the monstrous is not containment but fluid excess. As I mentioned earlier, the attribution of excess to the monstrous can be traced back to Aristotle, and has always marked the failure of monstrous corporeality to stay in place, to respect the boundaries of categorization. The excessive and malformed, especially hybridity, is a dangerous embodiment that resists systems of logic and regimes of identification. And it's through the unpredictable power to disturb and unsettle boundaries, this irreversible indeterminacy that resists final intelligibility, that the monstrous provides us with a powerful incentive to rethink the ethics of representation. Excuse me. For Derrida, it concerns not the manifestation of what's already seen, but the sense of what is to come, the avenir, whose coming, not yet, and maybe never realised, cannot be controlled. It's the very undecidability of the monstrous that may signal a way forward. So he says a future that would not be monstrous would not be a future. It would already be a predictable, calculable, and programmable tomorrow. All experience open to the future is prepared or prepares itself to welcome the monstrous arrivant. And it's not just that the arrivant is undecidable in itself, although the encounter is always in one sense awaited, it's also unexpected. Rather than the encounter being the moment of the recuperation of alterity, the violent scene in both actual practice and in theory of conventional representation, it's a confrontation with what is both a constitutive outside and an impossible, irreducible excess. At the same time, the implied refusal of linear temporality in the phrase avenir is no mere play on words, but a marker of what is yet to come is paradoxically already here. If the other is both excessive and constitutive of the self, then it cannot be assigned to either a fixed time or a place. Our ethical responsibility cannot be determined, but nor can it be deferred. It encompasses both our own becoming and the coming of the other, who has been here from the first. Now, such a reading goes much further than simply acknowledging the familiar uneasiness and the undoubted voyeurism of images of deformity that provoke and engage us. And this goes instead in a Derridean way to the exhortation to preserve the strangeness, the uncertainty, and the risk of the unreclaimed monstrous other. If the other in its non-conformity eludes any conventional designation and remains beyond the limits of intelligibility, then no form of representation will be adequate. Nevertheless, any practice, including monsters, relies on representation, so the limits of what is materialized must be open to ethical scrutiny. Now, as I see it, two things are required by the otherness of the monstrous other. First, I need to question the parameters of my own identity and to accede to the realization that I am not a stable point of reference, the one who knows. It is not a question of more or less adequate knowledge, but of an encounter with the irreducibly different in which I re-encounter myself. Second, it requires an acceptance of the decentering of the human as such. So long as difference remains locked into binary structures, all modes of representation inevitably refer back to the clean and proper standard that can be satisfied not only by forms of being that display conventional morphology, but that are unquestionably human. Ethical responsibility lies then in recognition as an appropriative move, as though the other could always be encompassed by the categorical limits that conventionally define my own being in the world. Nor is it an insistence on absolute difference, for that would be to vacate entirely any possibility of an ethical question. The critique of representation must provide a hopeful indication that there are other ways of being that will continue to exceed the structures of normativity. So let's reimagine visual representation as at very least ambiguous. On the one hand, as pertaining to the need for closure and order. On the other, as an invitation to a fluid opening to alterity. The excess of the monstrous surely gives rise to a breach in which the event of visualization is an overture to the imaginative disclosure of other worlds. It speaks to an avenir, a fantasy of what is beyond that can shatter normative structures and bring into being transgressive possibilities. There are multiple articles addressing the monstrous other in literature, film, art, that are focused on the avowedly sexual resonance of the extraordinary body. And such analyses are usually read through the eyes of subjects who are reluctantly normative, and they wish to escape the strictures of their own lives by identifying partially, at least, with what appears to be transgressive. Now, I'm not denying that there may be political value in such an approach, but rather than focusing on how the normatively embodied may queer themselves, it's more interesting to trace whether the monstrous other can productively exceed that self-reflective process. Moving away from a surface and mirroring instead the viewing subject, the question is, can some less visual facets of the other break through to radically contest the nature of the symbolic order? The becoming of the monstrous other is problematic, but I want to hold open undecidability as a virtue. And I wonder if the postmodern philosopher Gilles Deleuze might be a good guide here. My final section then seeks to briefly engage with Deleuzean philosophy on the question of becoming monster, which to him is a form of becoming minoritarian, and on the radical implications of corporeality in the mode of assemblage. The issue is how to unsettle mainstream paradigms, and it's often veered towards a validation, that have often veered towards a validation of the anomalous as encompassing alternative ontologies and ethics. You think about the satire of Jonathan Swift or Donna Haraway's very famous declaration, "I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess," and Rosie Braidotti's prescient linking of Deleuze and the monstrous, and my own exposure of the dangerous discourses of disability and sexuality in which the monstrous also looms. In contesting socio-political conventions, the would-be subversive subject enters into what Patricia Cormack calls a perverse practice of resistance that seeks to reimagine meanings and values. And the point of perversion for Deleuze, and it mirrors Haraway's reduction of transgression for its own sake, is that it's a tactic to bring into question and disorder normative structures, not an end in itself. On this reading, it would be worth risking the seductive mixture of disgust and desire that deformity can provoke in order to open up these new possibilities. Yes, there is always the danger of romanticising conditions that many people who are thus labelled would find deeply distressing. And McCormack points out that it would be, quote, unethical to use perversion tactically without acknowledging issues of power, control, and oppression. And I hope that those issues will be properly addressed in this presentation. Now, in many accounts by freak show performers, right up to the present day, the desire is to refute dominant values while also honouring their own histories, particularly by refusing any sense of victimisation. And this is very powerfully exemplified in Todd Browning's film from 1932, Freaks, the perversity of which was such that it was banned for many decades. Of course, times change and you can download it online in its entirety. So how does this relate to a Deleuzean understanding of becoming? I see becoming as performative in the fluid sense. It's never an uncovering of an as yet obscured core, a moment of truth, as exhibition purports to be, but a dynamic process that neither imitates nor identifies with any category or form of organisation. It's fundamentally non-representational, figuring instead lines of flight, and becoming deterritorializes and releases us from the hierarchical binaries of real and fantastic, human or animal, normal or abnormal, and deals instead of multiplicities that can't be pinned down. Now, in that sense, the monstrous is not a form of lack, but a positivity, excessive to the embodied self and unfixed. The process of becoming monster is, of course, an opportunity to escape the dominant reality of exclusionary binary identities. Rather than entering into becoming as either one or the other, the flow produces something new that makes it much more than just yet another strategy of the conventionally embodied subject. In place of the separation of subject and object, self and other, seer and seen, becoming generates material linkages that can't be traced to either an origin or an end. And these are the multiple eruptive and transformative connections that give rise to what Deleuze and Guattari call assemblages. Becoming monster then pushes us away from how we are defined, not to the emergence of a new individual, but to forms of concorporeality, in which the self and other are no longer distant. In a Deleuzian scenario, the differential being of any subject is always in the process of unravelling to enter into new alliances that are not marked by any essential form or teleology, but by energy, speed, and fluidity. When Deleuze insists on the rhizomatic nature of life, and this is the best illustration I could find of a rhizomatic connection, what he's talking about is its proliferation, life's proliferation in ever new forms along multiple and unpredictable pathways. And he's signalling a state of becoming that goes far beyond any individual lived experience. Rather than providing a stable centre, a reference point for the grasp of knowledge or agency, the body in question is a conduit for the intensity of apersonal possibility. The question, who am I, becomes redundant. There are no such boundaries, and above all, it's the monstrous as a hybrid assemblage that ruptures the conventional norms of ontological propriety. In the unlimited mode of an assemblage, no single unit, be it a body, an action, an identity, has meaning or significance other than through its irreducible connections with the affects of the other and the flows of energy. So you think all these things are linked together. You could point out there's a nodule, but it's linked to all the other nodules. So if they change, that nodule will also change. Oops. So in shifting the terrain, what happens is a different form of living, and it's a way that can dislocate the symbolic order and encompass radical difference. So the Deleuzian approach, even if it's not explicitly adopted, clearly offers reasons to be hopeful and confident that our reflections on monstrous corporeality have a critical perspective and substance and are not simply the occasion of indulging in our own desire to capture difference. But for all that, I want in conclusion to be clear that this presentation should cause some discomfort, some anxiety that we are complicit with the very standards that we might wish to unravel. Now, it's a delicate undertaking to engage with both salivation and critique, and there's always the risk of failure. But as I understand the issue of how we represent others to be of ethical concern, I'd also stress Derrida's insight that there is no possible moment in which an ethical demand can be fully satisfied. It remains, as always, an excessive demand, an horizon of aspiration. In our case, a necessary corrective to the desire to celebrate the transgressive without precaution. So our longing for the monstrous is rich in both problems and impossibilities. Let's keep both in mind and acknowledge the risks even as we open up to indeterminate forms that point to more positive alternatives for all of us. And it's only by taking that gamble that we can hope to unfold the promises of monsters. Thank you.
Thank you, Margrit, for your wonderful talk. It was really stimulating, I think. I will make use of the fact that there's a microphone glued to my head to ask the first question. So you started your presentation with noting that what appears to be beyond normative boundaries, that makes us ask the question, who am I? And then you concluded, moving into the direction that the who am I becomes somewhat redundant. Now the theme of this year's Day of Philosophy is who are we? I was wondering whether you could comment or say something more about this relation between the who am I question and the who are we question, because I mean you touched upon it, of course, during your lecture, the idea that the I is not singular, and that it's not a stable point of reference. But I was wondering whether this idea of corporeality, it's a difficult word, is it to be understood as a we that is in some sense a plurality of I's, or is that totally not what you're saying?
Yes, it's the question, who am I? And I was very aware of that being slightly problematic, as you brought up, because my thesis is really that we don't exist independently. We exist through these amazing interconnections. So it's always a we, but the we isn't always human. So these connections could be all sorts of other things. Some of them will be other humans, some of them will be animals, some of them will be events, some of them will be rocks. I mean, all sorts of things could be going on in these connections, but the point of this rhizomatic schematization is that as one thing changes, everything else must change too. So there's no fixed point. There's no arrival at a we any more than there could be an arrival at an I. So in deconstructing an I, saying, well, who am I? Well, I'm not an I. I'm a figment, an element in a greater assemblage. But that is not fixed either. That's not stable. That's going to go on changing. It's a dynamic assemblage. So that's how the relationship works. And the important point is it's not only human beings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's always a we, and it's not always human beings. And then for the notion of the monstrous, so it seems to me that your analysis really touches on that question of who are we, by thematizing this understanding of a we in connection to the monstrous. And maybe just to push a little bit more on that question, do you think that the monstrous helps an understanding of such a we, or rather that the monstrous is rather something that destabilizes the we, or both, or neither of it?
Both.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly, I think I would say that the monstrous for the whole of history has been an unstabilizing facet. It's unpredictable. It's represented as both awesome and threatening at the same time. It's full of ambiguities. So it helps us to think differently. And in terms of the we, what it's doing is saying none of us are stable. So it's not just those monsters out there, the ones at a distance, who are unstable, who are never going to be predictable. We're all in the same situation. We tend to think of people, for example, we think of people with certain disabilities as being intrinsically vulnerable. But my thesis would be that we're all vulnerable because we're all interconnected all of the time. And changes in another person's experience of life would be changes in my experience of life and how I thought about what I was doing. So these things, the we is there in some sense. And it could be little nodules of things that we could identify at any given moment as, this is me, that's you. But nevertheless, there is this web of interconnection, rhizomatic web, in fact, which reminds us, or should remind us, and this is what the monster does, that we are all part of this incredibly interconnected and intra-connected whole. And I'm saying intra-connected because there has been a long history of thinking of microbes, particularly bacteria and viruses, as monstrous. I didn't show it, but I have a wonderful slide from the 19th century of bioscientists fighting microbes represented as monsters. So this goes on. But now we accept, because of the microbiome, we all know about our microbiome, it's full of bacteria, and we started calling them good bacteria, and you can buy good bacteria over the counter. So things change. Viruses, unfortunately, have not been reformed. They're still bad viruses. But the bacteria, many bacteria have been domesticated. This is what we do. We try to keep order. Instead of saying, look, what goes in my microbiome shows that I am not singular, I am not whole, I am not bounded. I am intricately connected to the world outside. What that does is say, okay, but we have good bacteria, so we host them, we're really nice to them, we buy them over the counter, and that shuts us down again. And I think what we're trying to do is to think about there's risk, there's vulnerability, you can die. You can get a bad bacteria, you can get a virus that kills you. Of course, we all know this from COVID. But at the same time, those interconnections are fundamental. And also, I'm just going to add this, it's not to the point of this lecture, but viruses make human life possible. Evolutionary speaking, if there were not viruses, there would be no human life at all. So that interconnection is precisely what the monstrous should remind us about.
So, thank you for your answer. So it seems to me that this idea that the we is not stable, and you added that this should remind us of interconnectedness. So it seems to me that this is, in addition to an ontological notion or question, you also see a normative element there. So, and connected to this notion of risk and vulnerability. So it seems to me that this ontological thing of the we that is not stable also comes with a normative or ethical.
It certainly does, yeah.
Demand, if I could use that word, or question.
I think that's very important to bring up. Derrida talks, for example, about welcoming the monstrous arrivant. He's very clear that our responsibility, our ethical responsibility, is to extend a welcome. But he also says, so that sounds like, let's be hospitable to the monstrous other. But what he also says is that the host and the guest are interchangeable. And he says the guest becomes the host's host. If you think about microbes entering your body, our immune systems, for example, depend on our microbiomes to a large extent. So what comes in, we are not being hospitable, the guest becomes the host for the host. And I think this is really, really important to see that kind of dynamic exchange going on, where there's not self and other, where there's not some kind of exchange that can be stabilized, but is an ongoing way of, it's almost hybridity. I'm slightly reluctant to use the word hybridity because technically it means something else, but it is a form of hybridity, and we know about it now, certainly in terms of our own bodies. We don't think of our insides as being pure. We now know what goes on. And I think these are important ways of beginning to rethink how we might have a different relationship with all other forms of otherness, whatever they were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe to follow up on that, so what you said about bacteria and viruses and how in your last reply just now, on that notion of hospitability,
Hospitality.
Hospitality, and the intertwining of ontological notions and the more like normative ethical ones. You referred in during your presentation to the yuck factor. Made me think of that kind of reaction or emotion of disgust. What place or functionality would you see, or to the emotion of disgust as a moral emotion? Would you think that's from an ethical perspective rather positive or a problem?
I think it's a problem because it's a very defensive reaction. It's a reaction to something that we consider abject, something outside that we don't want to touch, something slimy, something that might contaminate. And of course, Kristeva talks a lot about how the abject is part of you. And the most abject thing, of course, is the corpse. In Kristeva's terms, we all become corpses. This is us. So I think the yuck factor is a form of, it's not me. I want an interval. I'm not going to touch that. I can look at it maybe, but I'm not going to touch. So the yuck factor is very much about, don't touch me, it's slimy, it's horrible, it's nasty. And that in normative terms is definitely something that is not helpful.
Mm-hmm. I'll ask another question, one about representation, and then I'll go to the audience. So on representation, at the beginning of your lecture, you referred to these early monster books, which kind of seem to reduce the monstrous figures to a relatively small number of images, in fact, which leads to a certain kind of domestication or taming of the monstrous and normalization. And it made me think of Instagram. Social media, with all this overflow and overload of images, which there's a wilderness out there, but at the same time it also seems to be some form of taming, and made me think of a recent interview of the Belgian photographer Bieke de Poorter, who says that we are consuming images as if they were candy. And that we enjoy seeing the pain of others because it's not our pain. Do you see, does that make sense, or is that?
Oh, totally. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And I think the proliferation of images, or text for that matter, saying the same thing has a numbing effect. And that we lose any sense of the real connection and how it might change us because we're putting things in their place by repeatedly saying that out there, not me. And I think things like social media in general do this a lot. And images, I mean, we're all familiar with the proliferation of images that build up, and you stop watching in the end because they're all the same. And the monster books, to a certain extent, were doing that. And it was all about creating an order where order actually doesn't really exist at all. It's the dangerous outside. So I totally agree with that. And, if we had time, we could discuss Susan Sontag, but I think we don't have time.
Maybe during coffee. Are there any questions from the audience?
Thank you very much. I mean, one of my conclusions would be listening to you that we should be open to, if you want, ugliness, the monstrous person. But I mean, if you take very young children and you show them either an aesthetically very beautiful face or, let's say, an extremely ugly face, I mean, they will react, I think, very differently. And so is, let's say, it's not innate, natural to react differently to, again, I mean, what is aesthetically beautiful and what is monstrous? Thank you.
I would not want to challenge your empirical way of putting it, but I would want to ask what influence is already there on the children who view either an aesthetically pleasing image or what they see as an aesthetically horrifying, even possibly frightening image. Nothing is given without some kind of context, and I suspect the context makes all the difference. I mean, one of the things that's really interested me, working a lot with a disabled colleague who uses a wheelchair, is that her experience of very young children was they were completely fascinated to encounter her. Adults weren't. They were always a bit sort of hands-off, don't come too close to me. But children wanted to be right up close because she was the same level as they were. And they felt encouraged to actually engage with her. And it was really, really nice to see that happening. And their mothers would often say, oh, come away, don't bother, come away. And so I think the context in which you're citing, you know, an aesthetic image against a not so pleasing image is one that's already affected because of the context in which it occurs. I mean, I don't know any empirical evidence either way, but that would be my guess.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is, if you could elaborate a little bit more, perhaps on the relationship between monsters and the notion of madness, because in your talk the notion of the body seemed very important for the monstrous, but madness is often seen as something that has nothing to do with the body, but with perhaps a lack or excess of reason. Also, Derrida has this debate on the notion of reason and its entwinement with madness. So how do you see this relationship between these two? And well, is this also a historical relationship? For instance, in these books on monsters are also notions of psychological disabilities mentioned, or is this really something that has to do with the body?
Historically, it's always been visual embodiment. And there may be elements that would tell us this is somebody with some kind of mental disability, a cognitive disability. But certainly in terms of the early monster books, that would not be the case. The interest in the mind is a much, much later thing in sort of bioscientific history. I mean, I wouldn't want to draw any distinction between physical and cognitive disability as such at all. So madness, if one is to define it as some kind of cognitive disability, would certainly be seen as monstrous. And again, have exactly the same reaction to it, like stay away, not me. So I think that's always there. So the distinction has evolved as we, I suppose, come to understand that the mind is something that can be interrogated through psychoanalysis or through bioscience or whatever else. So the mind is a much more modern idea of, what's going on here in terms of madness.
Thank you. I love what I'm hearing. For me, it's really useful to see things in terms of public and private, because I think images and representation are just what keeps us stuck in the private, but our bodies are very public. And also, I am me, but I'm also not me, in the sense that there's always a political intervention happening to me. I am at this crossroads of all these public things. But to be able to see oneself connected to others and not be subsumed by fear and paranoia, we need a sense of trust and this public joy and intimacy and not harming ourselves and others. And how do you relate to that trust?
I think trust is a very difficult concept, because I think it's important that we also recognize there are risks. If you welcome the monstrous arrivant, it may eat you, or if it's a terrorist, it may kill you. I mean, there are all sorts of risks involved, and I think trust is a fundamental aspect of hospitality, that you are welcoming in the other. But that twist, when the other becomes the host rather than the guest, is where the risk arrives. Now, I would say in ethical terms, it's important always to take that risk, and trust may be broken. But if we don't have the trust in the first place to make that initial opening, then we're not going anywhere. Those others will still remain as others. And, to put it in everyday terms right now, if you think what's happening with asylum seekers and refugees worldwide, you can see how tenuous the trust is, how people are continually being represented as threats. Threats to disorder, threats to borders, threats to women, threats to anything you can think of. So there has to be some initial trust, but it doesn't take away risk. And to be open to risk is to live more fully.
Do you think we sometimes need the classification of a monster to cope with certain things as a society? I'm thinking mostly of, for example, serial killers are often classified by people as a monster. And this seems to come from a need to cope with the fact that we don't really, well, most people don't understand why certain people do things they do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, it's not quite in the way that I would use the term monstrous, but it raises the interesting point that for serial killers, for people who have committed multiple crimes, I'm thinking, for example, about the guy who raped his wife and got other men to rape his wife continually, the case in France quite recently. What everybody says, he was just a normal man. He was just like us. He was just normal. And that's the shock and the horror that then people say, but no, he must be a monster. So what we do is we use the term monster to push somebody away, even when they have appeared to us before to be normal, within our bounds of possibility. And it's a term that gets used very, very easily. Sepho was talking about Trump being a monster at one point, and I said, let's talk about that. But you can see how the term gets used in that kind of way, because it is a term of abuse. It is a term of saying, not me. That person is not me. And that's what we do. And it's not to say that we condone their behavior. I mean, nobody is going to condone a serial killer's behavior or a rapist's behavior or Trump's behavior for that matter. But what you can say is it's a kind of form that allows us to put them out there in a separate category. And creating that category and then putting people into it and applying the term monstrous is a very common political thing to do.
There's another question at the back.
Thank you. I would like to ask you, you spoke about the numbness that occurs in our mass media because there's so many visual representations of monsters. So I would like to ask, is it still worthy to continue to make new concepts or visual artistic representations of monsters, or do you think it's there don't need to be new ones because there are already, the market is already so oversaturated? Yeah, that was. I'm kind of wondering, is it still okay to make new ones, to continue to challenge the norms of our society, or are there too many and have we become numb to it?
Yeah, short answer, I think it's always okay to challenge the norms of society when it's not the way in which you personally would want to live or want others to live. So I think making new representations is, in principle, a very good thing to do. But I think what I would say is it entirely depends on the self-awareness of control and power that goes into any representations. What is the person actually trying to do here? In representing that, what's their intention? What do they think they want other people to see? So the power and control there is really, really important facet of whether or not a new representation will move us in a good direction or a bad direction. And I think, it comes up so much when you look at some of the, I suppose what you would call exploitative, more the sort of pornographic side of representation. And the question is that doing any good at all? I mean, it's an open question because I think you could get people who are saying, yes, it is doing some good. I personally am not seeing that at the moment at all. But I think if there was a reasonable way of saying, this is about opening our horizons, this is about moving towards some other kind of imaginary, then new representations are a good thing. But if one can't self-reflect on that and can't think about what do we expect people to see, what do I see, what do I want to represent, then no, not so good.
There are 2-3 more questions. Yeah, first the one in the back.
Thank you. Thank you for your lecture. I'm curious a bit more about the ethical implications of this ontology of interconnectedness that you propose. Maybe my question would be, from the perspective of bodies that have historically been relegated to this category of the monster. What would your notions or your thinking be for them? What are the implications of this ontology of interconnectedness? Because I can imagine that there's also connections that these bodies might not want, especially connections to majority voices that have historically oppressed them and keep oppressing them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that goes back to what I've been saying about risk. None of this is risk-free. What I'm talking about is trying to promote a new imaginary in which people understand there are connections. Now, the value they put on connections may differ very greatly, but all the connections make a difference to the sort of existential becoming of, well, it's an assemblage rather than, you know, me or you or even a we, as we were discussing earlier. And I think, you know, the connections to people that you, or things or events that you would want to reject is part of that risk. But it also means you have to think of it in terms of one's own responsibilities. I mean, I'm very fascinated, if you remember the poster of the Hilton sisters for the film Chained for Life, it was a very, very weird kind of, but naive way of putting it. If one sister murdered her husband, who's guilty, who will get punished? And that's because they were connected. So the risk is right up their front. And of course, you know, this was just titillation for this film. But it's an interesting thing that if you think about connections in a very, very material way, then you have to take on board that your responsibility is not only to yourself. It's a much, much wider sense of responsibility, because obviously the connections you have with others, how they work, whatever they are, will affect you, but the connections that you have, what you do, how you think, speak, present yourself, go outwards at the same time. And we have to hold that possibility together with the risk.
So there's time for 2 more questions. I think there was one somewhere over there, and then one here at the front.
Yes, I was wondering, did you also look at what the representation of monsters when they cease to become a monster, to represent a monster for a society or for a we, for a group? What are the reasons for that? We have these fairy tales, and I'm thinking about dragons, and I'm thinking about some representations of witches, for example, that would never work as something monstrous today. And that says something about we or groups that evolve and that change perspectives. And I just wanted to hear your...
I mean, I think the important part is we do change our perspectives. We don't stay the same. We don't have the same prejudices. And obviously, historically, the kind of prejudices against witches, for example, or disabled people, is very different for how it might be for us now. So all of that is very changeable, and I think it's important to put that into a context of where we are as a society. But if it's simply a case of domesticating the monster, saying, well, actually, they're really just like us, and they're just, you know, really nice people, and they play by the rules, and we can fit them into the category of us rather than them, that's not necessarily a way forward. It's a way of using the grasp of knowledge. I understand them. I can put them into my category. They become understandable and defanged in a way. And it's really interesting thinking about witches, because obviously if you move from something like European witch trials, and the American witch trials for that matter, to the present day thing, all of that seems to have disappeared, but there's a thriving underground in black magic, and white magic for that matter, a thriving underground of people who don't want to be pulled into the mainstream. So it still exists as a sort of outside. And I think it's really interesting how we react to that and how we see that, and whether we want to sort of bring it out into the open in order to domesticate it, or whether we want to think about what other worlds does that open up onto, what other possibilities does that allow.
Okay, and then first here in the front. No, yep. It doesn't matter actually. Yeah, sir, please. Yeah.
In order to improve the world, I can imagine a yearly Nobel Prize without any financial benefit for the monster of the year, so that people would know this is a monster.
What kind of a monster would it be?
Who has caused?
I think you need to hold the microphone.
Who has caused most evil in the society?
Okay, this is why I didn't want to discuss Trump. Because to me, that is not a monster. That is using the term monster, but actually describing something rather different. Human behavior has always verged on good and evil, and this is an exemplification of it. So I don't personally, I like the idea of Monster Prize of the Year. I actually think that's rather good. But it's not the way in which I really understand the monstrous. I think it's just using a term that's out there in a vocabulary, but using it in a very, I suppose, unsophisticated way that just says anything we don't like we can call monstrous. Not to say some of them aren't.
Okay, last question.
Thank you. I was wondering, if we were to abandon our existing categories, isn't there a risk to lose a common intelligibility and an ethics that is based on this common ground of experience and intelligibility altogether?
Yes, that's precisely the risk, and I would say it's a risk worth taking, because what we do is pretend that those others out there, and particularly non-humans, I'm talking about animals, I'm talking about microbes, I'm talking about all the non-human things who are part of the assemblage of life get overlooked. So yes, we would lose that ethical perspective that we have now, but I think it would open other ethical perspectives where we could begin to be inclusive rather than exclusive. And this is always a horizon of aspiration. We're never going to reach it. We're never going to reach a point where we've actually included everything we should be including. It's not going to happen because, as you know, when you approach a horizon, it moves further away. So you're walking towards the horizon thinking, I'm getting there. And of course you're not, because the horizon has shifted. So it's a process. And a future imaginary is a process. It's not the moment you get to a new thing, a new kind of ethics, and then you stop. It's thinking all the time, dynamically, what would it be like if I included non-sentient animals, if I included tadpoles? No, they're sentient. Name a non-sentient animal. There aren't any, probably. If I included rocks in my assemblage, it's always moving towards what if, and there's no rest in it. I'm not opening up something about here's a better way of thinking. I'm saying we have to think, and we have to think critically, and we have to think beyond the boundaries of where we are now. We don't know where we're going, and it's a risk. And yes, going back to your question, we would lose the perspective we have now.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and for engaging with the audience. I want to invite you for another round of applause.
And thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.